I'm about to show you 6 magic system mistakes that new fantasy writers often make. I saw a lot of these when I judged over 100 magic systems as part of a contest that I ran last year. I've also seen many of these errors in the dozens of fantasy novels I've edited for my clients. And in my own fantasy books, I've also explored a ton of different magic systems, which has taught me a lot, starting with mistake number 1, the everything's a nail problem. When you've only got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. What does that mean and how does it relate to fantasy writing? Well, let me explain with an example here. Let's say you have a magic system where your main character can change the direction of gravity, either on herself or on someone else. In a fight scene, she uses this to send her opponent flying into the sky to defeat him. Okay, that's kind of a cool setup. But then let's say we go to a second fight scene and she beats her opponent in the exact same way. Then in our third fight scene, again, it's the same solution. She sends him flying off into the sky to beat him. This is boring because you're using the magic to solve problems in a repetitive way. But we come to stories to be delighted by unexpected solutions to tricky problems. So let's imagine that in our second fight scene, instead we set it indoors so she doesn't have the ability to use the magic in the same way. Instead, maybe she decides to use her gravity altering magic to make herself stick to the ceiling so then she can attack from above. That's in a much better direction because now we're seeing variation and uniqueness in how she's using that magic to solve the problems of the narrative. Fortunately, there's a simple way that you can make sure you're fixing the everything is a nail mistake in your own fantasy novel. And to discuss this, we need to move on to the second mistake. No consideration of limitations. When you see characters just snap their fingers and instantly magic away a problem with just godlike powers and zero effort, you probably feel really bored. It's hard to make a story interesting when your fantasy character is vastly overpowered and they can just use magic to do whatever they want. Of course, there are counterexamples. As with all of the mistakes in these videos, you can always find examples of characters or stories that do the opposite. But for the most part, when you have characters with vastly overpowered magic, the only way you can really challenge them is by making the conflicts non-magic related. So by making them sort of interpersonal or internal perhaps. So for example, with Superman, it's never a challenge whether Superman can catch a plane or not. But it might be more of a challenge if Lois Lane decides to break up with him. Generally speaking though, your fantasy book will be more compelling if you create interesting limitations around your magic system. So taking a character like Superman, for example, let's say you're writing a similar character who can fly. They can just sort of zip around anywhere. There doesn't seem to be any cost or any limitation. And the problem with this is there's not going to be that many interesting ways they can use their flying. You know, the first time they fly, cool, that'll be a nice moment. But then after that, it might just get a bit repetitive or it just fades into the background of your story. Now let's imagine instead that your characters can telekinetically push or pull themselves away from sources of metal. So perhaps they can drop a coin on the ground and then they can use that coin to propel themselves up into the air. You're still getting 80% of the benefits and interesting aspects of flying, but there's way more interesting limitations and combinations of this ability here. And of course, if you know what story I'm talking about here, this is essentially the allomancy magic system that Brandon Sanderson writes about in Mistborn. To quote from Sanderson himself, the question, what can't the magic do, is more interesting to me than what the magic can do. That's what gives a magic system compelling plot hooks. So with that in mind, here's 8 interesting ways to develop limitations for your magic system so that you can be telling a more interesting and unique fantasy story. Number 1, resource dependence. To use the magic, perhaps you need some special herbs or crystals, or maybe the stars in the sky need to be aligned in a certain way. And without access to this resource, you can't use the magic. Number 2, a physical or mental cost. Perhaps using the magic creates rapid aging or memory loss or makes you really tired. This limits how often the magic users can use the magic without facing severe consequences. This means that every choice to use or not use the magic is going to tell you a lot about your character, about what they value and about what they're willing to sacrifice. Meaningful consequences are so interesting. I love magic that takes a toll because it stops magic just feeling like an easy solution, an easy fix to all the problems in the story, and instead it makes it feel weighty and meaningful. Number 3, innate ability. Perhaps in your fantasy book, only certain people can use magic due to genetics or divine selection or some other kind of innate ability. Now, personally, out of all the limitations on this list, this is the one I find the least interesting because there's limited ability for character agency to kind of come into play when they've just been selected by some godlike being. Not to say you can't do it well, but I personally prefer some of the other limitations that I'm going to include here. Number 4, knowledge and skill. Maybe your magic requires a lot of training and a lot of study in order to become good at it. Generally speaking, this tends to be baked into almost every magic system out there. Number 5, cultural or legal restrictions. Perhaps your society has rules around how your magic is allowed to be used. This could be due to fear or religious beliefs or something else entirely. 6, magical interference. Maybe there's certain conditions that interfere or disrupt the ability to use magic. 7, time and place restrictions. Perhaps your magic can only be used in certain times, like when there is a full moon out, or in specific places, like maybe you can only use it in an ancient ruin, or you can only use it below sea level, or you can only use it when the temperature is between a very specific range. And then the last kind of limitation is number 8, binding agreements. So maybe in order to use the magic, you have to make a deal with the devil or some higher power, or perhaps with other magic users. And it creates this kind of binding contract that prevents you from using the magic in certain ways. Of course, with all of these limitations I've just listed out, hard magic systems generally do a good job of forcing you to really consider the restrictions and rules around your magic. However, it doesn't mean you need to use one of those, which actually brings me to the next mistake, thinking you need a hard magic system. Now, hard magic systems where you have sort of defined rules, restrictions, and limitations are awesome. I've written a ton of them in my own books. In particular, in Fires of the Dead, you've got the pyromancy magic system, and in the Kingdom of Dragons, you've got the kind of sun-based magic system that the Sun Wardens use. So I really, really love hard magic. But soft magic systems where the rules aren't always clearly communicated to your reader can be awesome as well. And again, I've explored those in Kingdom of Dragons. There are soft magic systems in that story as well, and in Across the Broken Stars as well. In the modern era, I think we've tended to see fantasy shift more towards the harder magic side of things. I think this can be really accredited to writers like Brandon Sanderson, who I absolutely love. Of course, there are many other writers that do great hard magic systems as well, and many writers who did hard magic back in the day too. And before we can talk about the unique benefits of soft magic, we should first understand why hard magic systems are so popular and why they are very effective for your writing. Here's the main one. When readers understand the rules of your magic, you can then play with those rules to create inventive solutions. So for example, in Fires of the Dead, my pyromancy magic system allows sorcerers to basically drop their blood into different fires to connect with those flames. They can then draw energy from those fires to project their own flames out of their hands and this sort of thing. So there's a scene where Wisp, my main character, is trying to ambush some bandits in a forest. What he does is he pricks his thumb with an arrow to get blood on the arrow, shoots that arrow into their campfire, thus bonding himself with that flame. He's then able to suck the energy out of the campfire, plunging them into darkness so that he can then attack. Now, when this happens, the reader doesn't feel cheated. They don't feel like I just made up this rule. It feels like a natural consequence, a natural extension of the rules that we both agreed upon earlier. And if you've read the climax of Fires of the Dead, you'll see how I take this even further later on. And as a side note, I actually had a reader email me about my pyromancy magic system the other day, just saying how much he enjoyed it, which was really, really cool. I love getting emails like that. So hard magic makes it really easy for you to create interesting promises and satisfying payoffs. It is a great foreshadowing tool. But soft magic systems can be amazing as well. And to explain the benefits and the kind of unique attributes of soft magic, I want to walk you through two of my favorite soft magic systems. The first is the spice in Dune. I recently saw Dune Part 2, the Denis Villeneuve movie in London, and it was just phenomenal. Utter perfection. It blew my mind so much that I was basically wandering around London in a daze for an hour afterwards, just listening to the Hans Zimmer soundtrack. And then a couple of days after I saw it there, I actually went off to the desert in Morocco. So I felt very immersed in the Dune universe.
Behind me here is the Sahara Desert.
Now, Dune revolves around this spice that lets you see into the future. But we never really understand the rules around this spice. There's no scene where the characters sit down and go, 1 gram of spice lets you see 1 hour into the future, but 2 grams lets you see 2 hours, or anything like that. And this is just based off having read the first 4 Dune books. Maybe it changes later on, I kind of doubt it. Instead, the magic is way softer. Some people aren't affected by the spice at all. Other people, like Paul Atreides, the spice allows them to see thousands of years into the future and gives them these huge kind of prophetic powers. And this very chaotic, mystical, spiritual nature of the spice hugely contributes to the psychedelic and hallucinatory nature of this book. Keeping the spice mysterious is the right choice for this story. And that's what you always want to be doing with your magic system, asking yourself, is this the right choice for the story I'm trying to tell here. The next soft magic system I love comes from The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This book is interesting because it actually has quite a few hard magic systems in it, but the most mysterious and interesting one revolves around naming, this concept that if you know the true name of something, you have power over it. This magic is super mysterious and it's shrouded in myth. When it's used, it creates these huge epic moments because of how rare it is and how hyped up it is earlier in the story. But again, we don't really know how it works. There's clearly some limitations because sometimes Quoth is able to call the name of the wind, other times he isn't. Yet again, it works because it just feeds into the wider nature of how this story deals with topics of myth and legend and mystery. However, and this is a really key point for you to be considering here, it probably wouldn't work if Quoth was using it every couple of pages. So again, this is why when it comes to you picking a hard or soft magic system, it's never a clear-cut choice. It's going to depend on so many factors like how often you're using the magic, what kind of emotion you're trying to create, and so many other things as well. Always consider how the magic relates to the rest of your story, which brings me to the next mistake, not integrating your magic into your triangle of story. Now, I've been writing for a really long time. At this point, I've put out 4 books, a video game, a bunch of short stories, and all up, I've written well over 1 million words worth of first drafts. And the more I have progressed as a writer, the more I have realized at the deeply interconnected nature of story. What do I mean by that? Well, fantasy stories are fundamentally underpinned by 3 core elements: plot, character, and setting, with theme created by the intersection of these 3 things. I call this the triangle of story. And if you're wondering what theme is, I simply define it as a moral argument about how best to live in the world. It's not about you shoving a concept down readers' throats or preaching to them. It's about giving your characters a difficult moral question to grapple with. So for example, the theme in a story like The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie would be war and politics corrupts even the noblest of intentions. You're going to have some characters that express agreement with that theme through the actions they're taking. You're going to have some characters who express disagreement with it, some characters who go from disagreeing with it to agreeing with it, vice versa, all these different combinations to explore this theme from many different angles. And what's key with the triangle of story is that when you think about great fantasy novels, you probably can't describe one aspect of the story without touching upon everything else that's involved. So in something like Lord of the Rings, for example, when you think about Frodo, who is a character, you immediately think about his journey across Middle-earth, so that's setting, to destroy the One Ring, that is plot. When you think about Harry Potter, so that's a character, you immediately think about Ron and Hermione, also characters, and their struggles to defeat Voldemort, that's plot and character. And you probably think about Hogwarts as well, which is setting. When you think about Ned Stark, you think about the cutthroat politics of Westeros, so that is plot and setting. Integrate your magic so that it feels essential and embedded into your story. That is, it is essential and embedded and a key part of your plot and your characters and your setting. This will make your story feel so much more resonant and cohesive. It also leads to a lot of epiphanies and writing breakthroughs. I find this a lot with the students that go through my fantasy outlining bootcamp. In the recent cohort, which we wrapped up about a month ago at this point, Christine found herself unexpectedly creating an entire plot outline for one of her characters, and this came after she was looking at how this character intersected with her theme. Here's what she said about the rest of the program.
It was incredible. It probably has saved me months or years of wandering with the story. It was a complete roadmap that took my story from the idea all the way through a finished outline. I think this is probably the best investment I've made in my writing, and I'll definitely refer to the recordings of this again and again. So if you're looking for a way to level up your writing and have a clear path to a finished manuscript, I can't recommend this bootcamp more highly. Thanks so much, Judd.
You can apply for the next cohort of my Fantasy Outlining Bootcamp by clicking the link in the description down below. Each cohort is really small. I keep them just to 8 students so that you get a ton of personal feedback and attention from me in there. And I absolutely love running these things. On the recent trip I did over to London, Morocco, and Spain, I actually caught up with 2 of my students from previous cohorts of the program. So I really, really love this program and I hope to work with you in there soon if it's a good fit for you. So how can you integrate your magic system into the triangle of story so that you can be writing a more cohesive fantasy book? Here's 5 questions I often ask myself to achieve this. Number 1, how could this magic system force your character to make a hard choice that reveals their true nature? For example, in Blackstone Heart by Michael R. Fletcher, who I used to host the Wizards, Warriors, and Words podcast with, he has this really cool magic system where you can summon demons and sacrifice human souls to them to get various boons. So this creates a lot of interesting tension. It's like, do you want to create a lightly enchanted shirt with some minor magical properties? Or do you want to build an entire magically enchanted suit of armor? The difference between those two things could be the difference of hundreds or even the thousands of souls that you're sacrificing. So how badly do you want that armor? That's going to tell you a lot about the characters when they're making this kind of choice. Number two, how might this magic force your character to have to grow and change? In Mistborn, Vin has to open up and begin to trust Kelsier if she wants him to teach her how to use her allomantic abilities. Number three, how might this magic create conflict between different characters? In the opening scenes of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the conflict between the Muggle Dursleys and Harry's burgeoning magical abilities creates a tremendous source of tension and is sort of the driving conflict for the first couple of chapters of that book. Number four, how might this magic influence society? In Jade City by Fonda Lee, you have the city of Janloon controlled by these criminal clans, and these clans are basically controlled by people with jade. Jade has magical properties in this world, and the amount of jade you wear determines your sort of status and hierarchy in this society, because the more jade you have, the more powers you have, but also the greater chance of the jade turning you insane. And so when someone walks into a restaurant in Janloon, you can instantly tell their status by how much jade they're wearing or not wearing. And then number five, what interesting set pieces and action scenes could this magic create? Using these questions will make your story far more creative and interesting and unique. And if you want to be writing the most unique fantasy novel possible, you also have to be very, very careful to avoid the next mistake, which I call the sloppy buffet problem. Okay, so a bit of a funny name. Let me explain what I mean here. Have you ever been to a buffet where you just see every single food imaginable, and in a fit of gluttony, you shovel a bit of every single food you can see onto your plate? However, when you actually start eating, you realize that while there's a lot of food, none of it is particularly good. By comparison, if you go to a fine dining restaurant, your meal might only have a couple of simple ingredients. Here, the chef has focused on doing just one thing, but they do that one thing so well. And sometimes when I'm editing fantasy novels for my clients, or I'm helping writers outline their stories in my fantasy outlining bootcamp, I see people make this mistake of just creating a magic system that is this huge buffet where they've got a bit of elemental powers in here, some mental powers in here, some telekinetic powers in here, some demon summoning powers in here, maybe even some time travel pieces as well. And the result is it just feels like there's so many things going on here, but nothing is working particularly well. And of course, there's nothing wrong with those elements I just mentioned. You can do any of them well, and there are stories that do combine these things in interesting ways. I'd say Rob Hayes' The War Eternal series is actually a very good example of this. Generally speaking though, great magic systems are simple. They take one principle and they expand from there. In the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks, you have this idea that you can look at different colors of light, and that allows you to then produce Luxon. Luxon is this kind of solid light that you can shape into various different forms to create different items or objects or different functions. Now, different colors of Luxon have different physical properties. Blue Luxon tends to be quite hard and rigid, while green Luxon tends to be sort of springy and flexible. Brent Weeks then extends this further. If you summon a lot of one type of Luxon, it begins to affect your personality. So if you summon a lot of blue Luxon, it begins to make you very cold and rational and emotionless. If you summon a lot of green Luxon, it begins to make you quite wild and rowdy. So there's great consequences baked into the magic, and from one simple principle, you can see how we extend out into many different variations and permutations and different abilities that all feel logically coherent and consistent. And speaking of logic, this brings us to mistake number 6, instant mastery. Seeing your character just instantly master a new magic system and be a pro at it with no training is usually kind of boring. We tend to sympathize more with characters who have to struggle to progress and gain skills and level up. Seeing them struggle to learn, experience setbacks, and then eventually reach a point of mastery or progression is intensely satisfying to read, because we love stories where we see the underdog progress against tough odds. This works particularly well if you can give us a hint of where the magic might be heading at the start of your story. So a technique that I really like, and I've used this in some of my books, is to show a side character who isn't the main character, so perhaps a mentor figure or an antagonist or a secondary character, display the upper limits of what the magic can be, kind of showing what the level 10 magic looks like. Then you contrast that against where your level 1 main character is. This creates a curiosity loop. Will our character progress up to this point? Or will he fail? If you want further inspiration to craft interesting magic systems, then check out this video where I share 18 ways to write unique magic systems in your fantasy novel.